The smell of the soup was still rising hot from the pot when Raphael stopped on the sidewalk, his frozen fingers gripping the metal handles, and he heard that sound again coming from the other side of the wall. It was a low, swallowed cry, like that of someone who weeps while afraid of being heard. The window of the neighboring house was lit at that hour when the whole street was already asleep, and the yellow light escaped through a slit in the curtain, drawing a trembling rectangle onto the cobblestone wet with dew. He stood still there in the June cold which descended from the mountains and bit at his ears, not knowing whether to move forward or go back inside, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. It had been 8 months since Marina had lived on the other side of that wall, and in 8 months they had exchanged at most 3 good days. Raphael knew about her what the street knew, that she was a widow, that her husband had died after a long illness, that she rarely went out, and that her sister appeared from time to time with grocery bags and left with a closed expression. He had never seen Marina cry. No one had. She was one of those people who go through pain with their heads held high, greeting the neighbors with a rehearsed smile as if the world couldn't bear to see them break. But that night, with the street empty and the cold tightening, the mask had fallen. And Raphael, on the outside, was holding a pot of soup in a dilemma that weighed more than it did. He almost turned back. Who was he to knock on the door of a woman he barely knew in the middle of the night, with a pot in his hand, like an intruder? She would think it strange. She would find it invasive. But then, in the silence between one sob and another, he heard his own mother's voice so clearly that he almost looked behind him. Raphael, when someone is suffering, you don't ask if you can help, you just help. Take them a plate of hot food. Hot food says what we don't know how to speak. Donna Aurora had passed away almost a year ago, and yet she was still there inside him, guiding his steps. He took a deep breath, the steam from his breath mixing with the steam from the soup, and crossed the few meters that separated his gate from hers. Before we continue, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. I love to know how far these stories reach. Now come with me, because this cold night was only just beginning. Raphael's house on the other side of that wall was the portrait of a man who had organized his loneliness until it became routine. Everything in its place, every day just like the one before. He woke up at 6, made coffee in the same chipped mug, taught music at a downtown public school, returned home, graded sheet music, ate dinner alone, watching the news, and went to sleep. At 39, he had the hands of someone who used to be a real musician, long fingers calloused at the tips, but the guitar had been leaning in the corner of the room for months inside its black case covered in a thin layer of dust he avoided looking at. Playing hurt. Playing meant remembering when he still had dreams, when he studied to join an orchestra, when life felt like an open road instead of a narrow hallway. He had given it all up at 32, when the doctor said that Donna Aurora needed care around the clock. Cancer, then complications, then years that dragged on between hospitals and sleepless nights. Raphael didn't hesitate for a single second. He left the big city. He left the orchestra auditions. He left his girlfriend who didn't have the patience to wait, and returned to that neighborhood house to be his mother's hands, feet, and courage until the end. He had no regrets. He would do it all again. But when she passed, he discovered he had forgotten how to live for himself. The silence of the house, once filled by her breathing in the next room, was now just silence. A silence that had weight, that occupied the chairs, that sat at the table with him. The neighborhood where Raphael lived was one that time seemed to have forgotten on purpose, and, thankfully so, cobblestone streets that made cars drive slowly, row houses, with colorful windows, low walls, over which neighbors exchanged plant cuttings and cake recipes. Early in the morning, the neighborhood smelled of bread coming out of Mr. Osvaldo's bakery on the corner, and of coffee rising from every kitchen at once, as if the whole street were waking up together. In the afternoon, the smell changed. It was beans simmering on low heat, garlic sautéing, some sweet treat bubbling slowly in a pot. Then, at dusk, when the fog began to descend from the hills surrounding the city, the air turned that damp cold of a mountain winter, the kind that calls for a wool coat, slippers swapped for socks, and hot tea in a mug. Raphael knew every sound on that street. The bread truck at 6 o'clock, the church bells on the hour, the barking of Mr. Osvaldo's mutt, the soap opera that Donna Iracema at number 12 watched with the volume way too high. It was a lively neighborhood, full of people, full of history. And yet, Raphael could go through entire days without anyone saying his name, because he had learned solitude. It is not the absence of people around you. It is the absence of someone waiting for you. Raphael had neighbors, school colleagues, students who adored him, but when he closed his front door at night, there was no one on the other side waiting to ask how his day had been. His coffee mug was for one, his dinner plate was for one. And little by little, without realizing it, he began shrinking his own life to fit into that size of one. He stopped inviting people over. He stopped cooking properly, because cooking for one is sad. He even stopped playing, because music, which had always been the thing that fulfilled him most, now only served to remind him of everything left behind. The guitar in the corner of the room was a tomb of what he used to be. That was why that night, when the crying crossed the wall, something inside Raphael stirred in a way it hadn't in a long time. He recognized that sound. Not the crying itself, but what was behind it, the loneliness of those who suffer with no one to hold their hand. He had cried like that so many nights, muffling his voice in his pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear, and suddenly it seemed absurd to him, almost cruel, that two people could live so close, separated by a brick wall of less than 2 meters, and suffer exactly the same pain, each locked in their own home, unaware of the other. It was this thought that made him boil the pot of soup left over from dinner, season it again, heat it well, and head out into the night. The church bell up on the hill struck 10 o'clock when he reached Marina's gate. The fog was coming down low, crawling, swallowing the bases of the lampposts. From a neighbor's chimney, the scent of burning wood rose, and from afar came the lazy bark of a dog. Raphael stopped again, his courage nearly failing him, and then, before he could think better of it, he raised his hand and knocked 3 light taps, almost as if apologizing. The crying on the other side stopped suddenly. There was a long silence, the silence of someone wiping their face in a hurry and holding their breath, hoping the visitor would go away. But Raphael did not go away. He waited. And it was in that instant, with the pot cooling in her hands and her heart pounding, that the story of 2 strangers began without either of them knowing how connected they already were. On the other side of that door, Marina pressed a crumpled tissue against her face and prayed that whoever it was would give up and go away. It wasn't fear of a robbery. On their street, everyone knew each other. It was shame. The deep shame of being seen in that state, with swollen eyes, unkempt hair, and a house she didn't have the heart to clean. It had been 13 months since Henrique died, and everyone told her it was time to move on, as if grief were a room you could just walk out of and lock the door. No one understood that she couldn't even change the bathroom towels because one of them was still the one he used, and changing it would mean admitting he wouldn't come back to use it again. Marina was 36 years old and felt like she was 80. The house, which once had been full of life, was now a museum of what no longer existed. Henrique's coat remained hanging behind the bedroom door. His books, marked on the page where he stopped reading, were still on the nightstand. Her phone still had the last message he sent, a simple "Be home soon, my love," which she sometimes reread in the early hours until the screen went dark from exhaustion. She couldn't delete it. Deleting it meant killing him all over again. So she preferred to live in that suspended time where nothing moved forward and nothing healed. A clock stopped at the exact hour her world had collapsed. That afternoon had been worse. Marina had accidentally opened an old shoebox at the back of the closet while looking for a document. And instead of the document, she found her entire past. Photos from her teenage years, letters from her late mother, a graduation invitation, and at the very bottom, folded in 4 and yellowed by time, a piece of notebook paper she hadn't seen in 2 decades. Her hands trembled as she recognized it. She unfolded the paper with the care of someone handling a relic. And there, in the hurried handwriting of a teenager, was the phrase that had saved her life at 18. Don't give up. The world needs the music that only you know how to make. A friend who heard you. She never knew the name of that friend, and had never told this story to anyone, not even to Enrique. To understand what that note meant, we need to go back 20 years. Marina was 18, and her world had just collapsed for the first time. It had been 3 months since her mother had passed away. Suddenly, her heart stopped one autumn dawn. And it wasn't just any mother that Marina had lost. It was the woman who introduced her to music as a child, who saved money to pay for flute lessons, who sat in the front row of every performance with eyes shining with pride. For Marina, the flute had always been her mother. Playing meant talking to her. And now that she was gone, every note stung like salt in a wound. That year, there was a school music festival in Belo Horizonte, and Marina was entered by her teacher almost by force. She arrived there feeling empty, inside without the strength, even to play, carrying grief too heavy for a girl her age, determined to quit the flute forever after that day, because playing without her mother in the audience seemed to make no sense at all. She sat alone at the back of the auditorium, staring at nothing, when a boy she had never seen stepped onto the stage with a guitar and began to play. Marina never forgot that song. It wasn't a well-known song. The boy had composed it. You could tell by the way he closed his eyes, as if he were reading the melody from within. It was a song both sad and luminous, the kind that seems to understand exactly what we feel, without ever having met us. And as the boy played, something inside Marina, a light that was almost extinguished, began to shine again. She cried there alone, in the dark of the auditorium, and she cried not from sadness, but from relief, like someone discovering they aren't as alone as they thought. When the performance ended, she gathered the courage to look for the boy at the exit, but he had already gone. On the bench where he had been sitting, however, there was a folded piece of paper. She picked it up, thinking he had left it by mistake. It was written for her, or for anyone who might need it. Don't give up. Marina kept that paper for 20 years, and now, 13 months after losing her husband, she was holding it again, crying, not knowing that the author of that note was at that exact moment on the other side of her door with a pot of soup in his hands. Marina wiped her face with the back of her hand, tucked the note into her wool coat pocket, and walked to the door with her heart still racing. She opened it just a crack, with the security chain still on, and peeked out. Outside, under the dim porch light, stood her neighbor, the music teacher from next door. She knew his face but didn't quite know his name. Raphael stood there, a tall man with slightly hunched shoulders and a shy demeanor that didn't match his size, holding a pot in his hands. Marina frowned, not understanding what she did not yet know. What would take her weeks to discover was that the shy man on the other side of the door unknowingly held the answer to the greatest mystery of her life. "Good evening," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "Sorry for the late hour. I made soup today, there was plenty left, and I thought maybe you'd like some. It's very cold out." It was so awkward, so clearly a poorly constructed excuse, that, for an instant, Marina didn't know how to respond. She knew it wasn't by chance that there was leftover soup. She knew he had heard her. The houses were attached, the walls were low, and she had been crying too loudly. Her face burned with shame, and her first impulse was to shut the door, thank him politely, and disappear. "Thank you, but you didn't have to." The sentence was already on the tip of her tongue, the usual phrase, the one that kept everyone at a distance, but something made her hesitate. Maybe the cold, maybe the exhaustion of always being alone, maybe the man's expression, not looking at her with pity, but with a strange recognition, like someone seeing in another person a pain that is also their own. "You didn't need to trouble yourself," she said finally, her voice raspy from crying so much. "It's no trouble at all," Raphael replied. "My mother used to make this soup." She said that warm food says what we don't know how to put into words. He stopped, embarrassed by his own sincerity, and looked at the pot as if it could come to his rescue. Anyway, I don't want to intrude. I'll just leave it here. You can heat it up tomorrow. And it was that phrase, "My mother used to make this soup," spoken with a tenderness he didn't even realize he had, that disarmed Marina. Because it wasn't the line of a man trying to get close, it was the line of someone who also carried a void, who had also lost someone, who also kept a mother inside his heart. She unlatched the door chain, the metallic sound echoing in the freezing night, and opened the door fully, the warmth of the house escaping into the cold of the street. "Enter," she said, and her own voice surprised her. "At least have a coffee before you go back. It's too cold out there." Marina's kitchen was small and yellow, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling that cast a honey-colored light over the formica table. Raphael entered carefully, almost asking permission with every step, and set the pot on the stove. He sat in the chair she indicated, and stayed there, hands clasped on the table, not knowing what to do, with his large frame in that cramped space. Marina put the water on for coffee, and for a while neither of them said anything. But it was a different silence, not the heavy silence of their homes, but an almost comfortable one. The silence of two people who, without planning, decided to lower their guard for a few minutes. "Have you lived here long?" Raphael asked, more to fill the air than out of curiosity. "Could you call me by my first name?" she replied, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Calling me ma'am makes me feel older than I already do." She almost smiled, and it was the first hint of a smile in many days. "We bought this house about 5 years ago. Me and Henrique, my husband." Her voice stumbled slightly on the name, but she continued. "He passed away last year." "I know. I'm sorry." Raphael lowered his eyes to his mug. "I also lost my mother almost a year ago. We lived together, just the 2 of us. Then suddenly it was just me in the house." He shrugged, a small gesture that contained years of loneliness. "I know what the silence is like, especially. No one warns us about the silence." Marina stopped with her mug halfway to her lips, looking at him. It was the first time in 13 months that someone had told the truth about grief without stalling, without cliches, without that "he's in a better place" line she hated with all her might. That man had said exactly the right thing. The silence. No one warns you about the silence. About how it settles into every room. About how the sound of a single person living in a house is different from the sound of 2. About how we sometimes speak out loud just to remember what it's like to hear a voice. She sat across from him, and the ice between them began to slowly melt. They talked for almost an hour that first night. They spoke of the small things, the big things, the things in between. Raphael spoke of music, of the dream of an orchestra he had tucked away in a drawer, of the guitar he no longer played. Marina spoke of the flute she had also abandoned, of the school where she taught Portuguese, before taking the leave that turned into a suspension which turned into quitting. They discovered they liked the same old movies, hated the same soap opera, and both drank coffee without sugar, just out of stubbornness. Do you play the flute?" Raphael asked, and there was a new glint in his eyes. The look of someone finding their own language in a foreign country. "I used to," Marina replied, stirring the coffee that was already stirred. "Since I was a child, my mother got me into music, but my flute has been put away for years. After Henrique got sick, there was no longer an atmosphere for music at home. And after he passed," she shrugged. The house went silent. "I think I got used to the silence." "It's funny," Raphael said, turning the mug between his hands. "We live for music and are the first to stop playing when life gets tough. It should be the other way around, right? It should be exactly when we need it most. My mother used to say music is medicine, that it heals what doctors can't reach. But I, a musician, have let my guitar gather dust for almost a year." Marina looked at him for a moment, and something in her face softened. "Why did you stop?" Raphael took a while to answer. He looked at the bottom of his mug, as if the answer were there. "Because playing is remembering," he said finally. "And for a long time remembering hurt too much. Music reminds me of my mother, of the dreams I had, of the life I didn't live. so it's easier not to play." He looked up and gave a crooked smile. "But just look at us. Two musicians who stopped playing, drinking coffee in a kitchen past midnight in the middle of winter. If it weren't sad, it would be funny." And it was Marina who laughed first. A short, surprised laugh that escaped her before she could stop it. It had been months since she had laughed, and the sound of her own laugh startled her a bit, as if she had forgotten she was still capable of it. Raphael laughed along, and for a moment, the yellow kitchen filled with something those two houses hadn't known in a long time: lightness. They talked a while longer about the city, about the neighbors, about the food one's mother and the other's grandmother used to make. Marina shared her fear of forgetting her husband's voice. Raphael told her about the day he almost sold his guitar and didn't have the heart to do it. They were two people who had lost the habit of being heard and who, now without haste, were rediscovering the simple pleasure of having a pair of ears on the other side of the table. And when Raphael finally got up to leave, it was past midnight, and something had changed in the air. It wasn't love yet. It was something simpler and rarer. It was the recognition that they weren't as alone as they thought. "Thanks for the soup," Marina said at the door, hugging herself against the cold. "And for the company. It's been a long time since I've talked to someone." "I'm the one who should thank you," Raphael replied. "Good night, Marina." It was only when he had already crossed the street and was unlocking his own gate that she realized he had said her name and that she still didn't really know his. She almost called him back to ask, but the cold and exhaustion won out, and she closed the door, leaned against it from the inside in the dark hallway, and, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel the crushing weight of the empty house. She felt, instead, something warm and small in her chest, something she no longer even knew how to name. It was hope. Quite small, the size of a pot of soup, but it was hope. In the weeks that followed, the wall between the two houses ceased to be a border and became a meeting point. It started small, as true things do. Raphael returned the washed pot with a cake inside. Marina reciprocated with a jar of dulce de leche made by her. A good morning that used to last a second now lasted 10 minutes. The two leaning against the backyard wall, he with his coffee mug, she with her hair brushed, her face less tired. The neighborhood began to notice, and the street, which is like every small-town street, began to comment. But Raphael and Marina didn't care, or pretended not to. They were too busy rediscovering something they both had given up as lost: the simple joy of having someone to share the day with. Neither of them suspected, however, that on one of those late afternoons at the wall, Marina would open her mouth to tell a 20-year-old secret, and that this secret would change everything between them forever. It was on one of those afternoons, a rare sunny Saturday in the middle of winter, that the confession happened. They were both sitting on little stools in Marina's backyard, enjoying the timid warmth of the sun, when she, without him asking, began to tell the story she had never told anyone. She spoke of the mother she had lost so young, of the flute that was the voice of them both, of the 18 years she almost gave up on music forever. Raphael listened in silence, seriously, knowing instinctively that this was something she kept under lock and key. And then Marina pulled from her pocket a paper folded in 4, yellowed, worn at the creases, and placed it on her knee. "I've never shown this to anyone," she said, in a low voice. "Not even to Henrique. There was a day, when I was 18, when I went to a music festival in Belo Horizonte, a few months after losing my mother. And it wasn't just my mother, Raphael. She was the person who put the flute in my hand, who taught me to love music. She died of a heart attack, all of a sudden. So I went to that festival, decided to give it all up, to never play again, because playing, without her listening, hurt too much. You can't imagine the size of the void I was carrying." She took a deep breath, her eyes welling up, and then a boy got up on stage. I didn't know who he was. He played a song on the guitar, a song he had written himself, you could tell. And that song, I don't know how to explain it. It was as if someone, for the first time, understood exactly what I was feeling. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. And when it ended, I went to look for him, but he had already left. Bah! He just left us on the bench. She unfolded the paper with trembling fingers and read it aloud even though she knew every word by heart. Don't give up. The world needs the music that only you can make. A friend who heard you. She raised her eyes to him, smiling through her tears. This note saved my life, Raphael. I went home because of it. I made my decision because of a boy whose name I never knew who played a song on a stage and left a note on a bench. I've kept this for 20 years. Isn't it funny? We never know what saves us. Raphael had become very quiet. Marina, absorbed in her own story, didn't notice the change in his face right away, but when she did, she found it strange. He was pale, his eyes fixed on the paper, his lips parted as if he had forgotten how to breathe. His hands, which had played the guitar for 30 years, were trembling slightly on his knees. For a long moment he couldn't say anything, and when he finally could, his voice came out as a thin, broken thread, almost a whisper. Belo Horizonte, School Festival 2004. He swallowed hard. The music, it started slowly, just 3 repeated notes, and then opened up into a higher part, almost cheerful in the midst of the sadness. Was it this? Marina went pale. The smile died on her face. How do you know about that? Raphael brought his hand to his chest, as if he needed to hold his own heart in place. When he spoke again, his eyes were full of tears and his voice was barely steady. Because the music was mine, Marina. It was me who played it. It was me who wrote that note. Time seemed to stop in the backyard. The sun kept on shining. A bird sang somewhere. The world kept turning indifferently. But for those two sitting on the small benches, the entire universe had compressed into that impossible instant. Marina looked at Raphael, unable to process it. 20 years. For 20 years she had kept that note. She had gone through adolescence, marriage, widowhood. She had built her whole life starting from that moment, and the author was there in front of her, living, on the other side of the wall, drinking coffee in her kitchen, bringing soup on a cold night. She brought her hands to her mouth. The tears came without her being able to hold them back. For a long moment, neither of them could speak. The silence in the yard was great, but it wasn't empty. It was a full, dense silence, the silence of 2 lives reorganizing themselves at the same time before a truth that wouldn't fit into words. Marina looked at his face, searching for the 21-year-old boy, and, little by little, beneath the wrinkles and the stubble and the weariness of 40 years, she found him. The same eyes, the same way of furrowing his brow. It was him. It had been him the whole time. It can't be, she whispered. It can't be you. This isn't possible. I was 21 years old, said Raphael, his voice choked up. I was playing at that festival representing the music school where I studied, and there was a girl in the back of the auditorium that I saw from where I was. She was so dim, so lonely. I didn't know her, but I felt I had to play for her. You know when you look at a person and feel their pain from across the room? It was like that. I played that song thinking of her, only her. The entire auditorium vanished. And afterward I wanted to go talk to her, but I was a shy kid. I was dying of embarrassment. So I wrote that note in a hurry, left it on the bench where she was sitting, and slipped away before she came back. He laughed a laugh wet with tears. 20 years, Marina. 20 years I've carried this story. I always wondered if that girl was okay if she read the note, if it served any purpose. There were nights I lay awake thinking of her, not even knowing her name, hoping she had turned out all right in life. I never knew until now. Marina was crying and laughing at the same time, her face wet, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his. It did, she said. It served for everything, Raphael. I read that note on the bus, going home, and I decided to keep going. I decided that if a stranger, a boy I didn't even know, thought the world needed my music, then maybe it was worth staying to find out. I started playing again. I finished school. I graduated. I became a teacher. I met Henrique. I lived, Raphael. I lived an entire life because of a piece of paper you left on a bench. She squeezed his hand tightly. You saved my life without even knowing my name. And then life brought you back to me, on the other side of a wall, just when I was sinking again. If that isn't a coincidence, what is? And there in the yard, under the winter sun, two strangers who were no longer strangers at all held each other's hands, understanding for the first time that fate had brought them together not once but twice, and that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a coincidence. The following days were strange and luminous for both of them. There was a vertigo in the air, the feeling of being before something too big to fit into an ordinary life. Raphael spent sleepless nights turning over the memory of that festival, searching his mind for the face of the girl in the back, trying to fit it onto the face of the 36-year-old woman, who now occupied his thoughts. Marina, in turn, felt the ground of her own story shifting. Everything she thought she knew about chance, about fate, about loneliness, needed to be recalculated. If that note had saved her at 18, and if its author was now by her side when she needed him most at 36, then what did that mean? She was afraid to answer, because along with the enchantment came guilt. A heavy, dense guilt that rose in Marina's chest every time she caught herself smiling. Henrique had been dead for a little over a year. How could she be feeling that? Those butterflies in her stomach, that urge to see the neighbor, that care, and getting ready before going to the yard. Wasn't it betrayal? Wasn't it disrespectful to the memory of the man she had shared her life with? One of those early mornings, she opened the wardrobe again, pressed her face against Henrique's coat, which still faintly smelled of him, and asked for forgiveness, crying softly like someone confessing a crime. I'm sorry, my love. I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't look for this. Raphael carried his own guilt. He thought he was moving too fast, too soon, that he was taking advantage of a woman fragile from grief, and the idea horrified him. Without saying a word, he began to pull away, to limit their meetings at the wall, convinced it was the right thing to do. But his retreat, instead of protecting Marina, hurt her. She read his distance as regret, as if he had seen something in her that wasn't worth it, and she closed herself off again, the mask settling back over her face. In a few days, the wall became a border once more, the lights in the two houses turning on separately again. Two cowards who already knew their heart's answer, but didn't have the courage to say it out loud. And what neither of them imagined was that it wouldn't be long before a third person entered the scene and turned everything upside down. The one who broke the impasse was, unintentionally, Marina's sister. Donna Bernadette appeared on a Sunday, as always, with grocery bags and the face of someone carrying the world. But this time she found the house different, the curtains open, a vase of flowers on the table, and on the stove a borrowed pot she didn't recognize. Bernadette was older, harder, molded by a life of hardship, and she saw the world in black and white. When she understood from Marina's evasions that there was a man involved, that it was the neighbor, and that they had been talking, her face closed like a slamming door. "Have you lost your mind, Marina?" said Bernadette, her voice cutting. "Enrique hasn't even been cold in his grave yet, and you're already chatting with the neighbor. What will people say? What will his family think? Do you have no shame?" No, the words hit Marina like stones, each one in the exact spot where she was already hurting on her own. She lowered her head defenselessly, because her sister was saying out loud everything she told herself in the dead of night. Bernadette left, slamming the gate, and Marina stood still in the kitchen, feeling the little bit of light she had gathered in recent weeks slip away like water through her fingers. She decided then and there that she would stop, that she would distance herself from Raphael for good, that she would lock the door to her heart again, because hurting alone was safer than risking hurting others. She sat at the table and cried until she had no tears left. But it was precisely that night, the darkest since the night of the soup, that Raphael, knowing nothing of what had happened, crossed the wall again. He couldn't stand the silence anymore. He couldn't stand the distance he himself had created. And he arrived at her door, determined to be honest for the first time in a long time. He knocked. Marina opened her red eyes, and, before she could say anything, he said it all at once, rushing his words, afraid of losing his courage. "I walked away because I was afraid," he said. "Not of you, Of myself, of making you suffer, of being selfish, of wanting something that maybe wasn't the time for. So I thought the right thing was to disappear, but I spent all these days feeling worse than ever. Because the truth, Marina, the truth is that I don't want to disappear. I waited 20 years without knowing I was waiting, and I don't want to wait anymore. Marina looked at him, her face wet, her heart split in two between what her sister had said and what that man was saying now. And then she did the hardest and bravest thing she had done in 13 months. She decided to be honest, too. "My sister was here today," she said, her voice trembling. She said, "I have no shame that Henrique isn't even cold, and I'm already—" She swallowed her tears. "And the worst part, Raphael, is that a part of me thinks she's right. I feel guilty. I feel guilty for smiling, for wanting to see you, for liking you, because I loved Henrique. I loved him for real, and loving you now feels like it's erasing him." Raphael took a step forward, and with a gentleness that belied the size of his hands, held her face. "Marina, listen. Loving again doesn't erase anyone." His voice was firm now, firm and tender. "I still love my mother to this day. She lives here." He took her hand to his own chest, "and she will live there forever. And if one day I am happy again, that won't take her from her place. It will only prove she taught me how to love properly. Henrique will live inside you forever. Whatever we build with him included, not over him. The heart isn't a house with just one room, Marina. It fits many people inside. It fits those who left and those who stayed." Marina collapsed onto his chest, crying. But it was a different cry from all the others in recent months. It was a cry that set her free instead of trapping her. And there, on the doorstep where it all began, under the same chill of that first night, she understood that Raphael was right, that loving again wasn't a betrayal, it was an honor. It was proof that the love she had lived taught her to recognize love when it knocked on her door again with a pot of soup in its hands. Spring arrived slowly that year, and with it came the small changes that announce a life rebuilding itself. The first of them was the guitar. On a September afternoon, Raphael took the instrument out of its case for the first time in almost a year. He wiped the dust off with a soft cloth, tuned string by string with the care of someone reuniting with an old friend, and sat in the yard. Marina, on the other side of the wall, stopped what she was doing. He started to play. His fingers were a bit stiff at first, stumbling, rediscovering their way on the strings. And after a few measures, the music flowed. It was that song, the same one he had played on a stage in Belo Horizonte 20 years earlier, the one that had saved the life of a girl he didn't know. Marina dropped everything and ran to the wall. She leaned against it and listened, her tears flowing freely now without any guilt at all. At 18, she had heard that song alone in the dark of an auditorium without knowing who was playing. Now at 36, she was hearing it again in the sunlight, knowing every detail, who was playing, why he was playing, and for whom. And this time, when the music ended, the musician didn't run away. He looked over the wall, met her eyes, and smiled. And she, who had spent 13 months thinking she would never truly smile again, smiled back with her whole face. Little by little, their lives became intertwined for all to see, and the town, which at first gossiped maliciously, surrendered to the evidence that what they had was something beautiful. Breakfast on the backyard wall became a routine, and later they turned into afternoon coffees too, and then dinners, with each of them bringing a dish. The table was set sometimes in one house, sometimes in the other. Raphael discovered that Marina made the best chicken with okra he had ever eaten. And Marina discovered that Raphael, despite being clumsy in the kitchen, made cheese bread that was worth forgiving any flaw. On Sundays, they began walking together to the downtown market. She arm in arm with him, choosing the fruits, tasting Mr. Geraldo's cheese, laughing at the same silly things. The small town, which sees and comments on everything, gradually stopped whispering, because there is no gossip that can withstand the sight of two happy people holding hands at the market on a sunny Sunday. The owner of the produce stand, who had first turned up her nose, started saving the best mangoes for Marina. Mr. Osvaldo from the bakery began calling Raphael the guy with the pretty girlfriend. Even Mrs. Irasima from number 12, the biggest gossip on the street, had to admit to her friends that those two were made for each other. It just took them 20 years to figure it out. The whole street, without planning it, adopted the two neighbors' romance as if it were their own family affair, which, in a way it was, because in a small town, a neighbor's happiness is, to some extent, everyone's happiness. The only one who resisted was Bernadette. Marina's sister didn't return home for weeks after that argument, and her silence weighed more than any words. Marina would call, and her sister would reply curtly with half sentences, with that coldness that only family resentment knows how to create. It hurt Marina, because Bernadette was all that was left of her family, the only one remaining to remember her mother, their childhood, their roots. And Marina refused to choose between her sister and her new happiness. She wanted both things. She needed both. It was Raphael who, with tact, found the way. One Sunday, without telling Marina, he went to Bernadette's house carrying a toolbox. Her kitchen faucet had been dripping for months. Marina had mentioned it in passing once. Raphael knocked on the door and was met with her usual stern face, but he wasn't shaken. "Miss Bernadette, I didn't come here to talk. I came to fix this faucet that's letting your money drip down the drain. You can send me away later if you want." And he stayed there on his knees under the sink for almost an hour, replacing the washer, tightening the screw, while Bernadette watched from the corner of the kitchen, not knowing what to do with a man who wouldn't be offended. When he finished, the faucet was dry, and Raphael, noticing the old guitar leaning in a corner that had been her father's, as Bernadette would tell later, asked permission and played a song, not just any song, but an old tune that their mother used to sing in the kitchen when they were girls. Marina had told him. Bernadette recognized the first chords, and her stern face, the face that life had hardened through hardship, began to soften. When the music ended, she was crying and could no longer pretend to be angry. The following Sunday, there was lunch at Marina's house and Bernadette came. She brought a dish of rice with piquet, sat at the table, and ate in silence at first, still a bit guarded. But Raphael made her laugh, telling stories about his blunders as a teacher, and by the middle of lunch she was already calling him brother-in-law without even realizing it. It was at the farewell, already at the gate, that Bernadette pulled her sister aside, held Marina's arm, looked deep into her eyes, and said softly with a choked voice, "Forgive me, okay? I was harsh. It's just that I was afraid to see you suffer again. Losing Henrique almost destroyed you, Marina. I saw it up close. So I thought protecting you meant keeping you away from everything, but I was wrong." She looked over her shoulder into the house where Raphael was humming while clearing the plates. "He is a good man. You can tell from a distance. Henrique would have liked him, and Mom would have loved him." Bernadette squeezed her sister's hand. "Be happy, my sister. You deserve it. You've suffered enough." And it was the blessing that Marina, without knowing, most needed to hear. Because it's one thing for our own heart to say, "It's time to be happy again." It's another to hear it from the lips of someone who carries the same blood, the same memory, the same mother. Raphael, for his part, went back to teaching with new energy and, more than that, started composing again. He started a small music group at the neighborhood church, teaching the local children for free who couldn't afford instruments, lending out his own guitar, one by one, like someone passing on what they had once received. He would say when someone asked why it was free, because one day, at a festival in Belo Horizonte, a 21-year-old boy played a song for a girl he didn't even know, and that saved a life. We never know which of these children will need a song one day, so I teach them all. Marina, for her part, picked up the flute again, at first only to accompany Raphael, then for her own pleasure. And finally she returned to the school where she taught, no longer like someone fulfilling an obligation, but like someone who, again, has something to teach. The two unintentionally became a kind of beacon in the neighborhood. People would pass by the street at dusk and hear music coming from that yard, a guitar and a flute talking, searching for each other, finding each other, and they would stop and smile and go home a little lighter. The kindness of a cold night had spread, as it always does when it is true kindness. Almost a year had passed since the soup night, when on a June afternoon, exactly in the season everything had started, the cold came down from the mountains again, the fog crawled along the cobblestone streets again, and the church bell struck the hour, as it always did. But the street was different now, or rather, one house was different because, that late afternoon, Raphael was no longer on the other side of the wall. He was on the porch of the house they now shared, the guitar in his lap, the coffee cooling beside him, waiting for Marina to finish setting the table for dinner. 2 chairs where before there was one, 2 plates where before there was one, and a pot of soup on the warm stove, made by both, shared by 2. Marina stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped for a moment just to look at that man whom life had brought to her twice. Raphael began to play softly that same old song. And she approached, leaned against him, and the two stayed like that, in the June cold, while the melody blended with the smell of the soup and the yellow light that escaped through the window. Except this time the lit window was not a sign of loneliness for anyone outside to look at with pity. It was an invitation. It was proof that behind that light there was life, there was music, there was love. Have you ever stopped to think? Marina said, her head on his shoulder, that if you hadn't brought that soup, we would never know. Raphael stopped playing, thought for a moment, and smiled. My mother, who knew, hot food says what we don't know how to say. He kissed the top of her head. I brought some soup, thinking I was just helping a neighbor on a cold night, and I ended up finding the girl from the auditorium. Life is like that, Marina. We do something small, something silly, and without knowing it, we're saving someone. Sometimes we're saving ourselves. She raised her face and looked at him, her eyes shining in the porch light. It's never too late, as it sounds. She said, it's never too late, he replied. To love, it's never too late. We just need to leave the door open for when happiness knocks. And there, on the porch of a simple house, on a cobblestone street in the countryside of Minas, 2 hearts that pain had locked chose with eyes open and no fear of the clock to keep beating together. Outside, the cold descended from the mountains as always, but inside that house and inside those 2 chests it was warm. The warmth of a soup shared on a cold night, the warmth of a second chance, the warmth of knowing that in the end, love always finds its way back home, even if it takes 20 years and a pot of soup to get there. If this story moved you, write one word down here, destiny. Because it was destiny that brought Raphael and Marina together twice. And I want to see how many hearts this story touched today. Tell me, which part hit you the deepest? Was it Raphael's courage to knock on that door in the middle of the cold? Was it Marina discovering that she kept for 20 years a note written by the person who lived on the other side of the wall? Or was it that guitar playing again after being silent for so long? And tell me where you're watching me from, which corner of Brazil this story reached you in. I read every comment, and I swear I get emotional with every new city that appears here. If you also believe that life has a way of saving a meeting for 20 years later, of having love knock on the door when we least expect it, leave your like so this story doesn't get lost. Did you think of someone who needs to believe in better days? Send this video to that person right now. And if you like these stories that warm the heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss any. We'll meet again in the next one. Until then, keep the door of your heart unlocked. You never know when happiness is about to strike.